Today in the Daily Dose, how Detroit outbuilt her enemies during World War II. When Allied troops landed at Normandy during the D-Day invasions of France, the invasion force included 50,000 vehicles of all types, well over 5,000 ships, and more than twice that number in airplanes. While many factors led up to victory, in both theaters of war, one key element was the ability of American industry to outbuild Germany and Japan in the largest mechanized war the world has ever seen. Detroit automakers played a key role in the Allies' victory when they switched from building cars to building the machinery of modern warfare. For example, Ford's enormous Willow Run plant produced a total of 8,685 B-24 heavy bombers, outputting one plane per hour by early 1945. Due to the use of interchangeable parts, Willys Overland, Ford, and Bantam produced more than 1.3 million Jeeps, or Blitz buggies as they were affectionately known. Just before his death in 1945, famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote of the Jeep, "Good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything, it goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat." Detroit also provided the war effort with a steady supply of tanks from Chrysler's enormous Detroit Arsenal tank plant, including 3,352 M3 tanks and 17,947 M4 Sherman Series tanks, or approximately 36% of the total 49,234 Sherman tanks built for the war effort. General Motors also joined the fight by constructing 21,000 amphibious landing craft known as duck boats, costing the U.S. government $10,800 for each amphibious vehicle rolling off GM's assembly lines. GM also produced an arsenal of other war materiel, including nearly 120 million artillery shells, over 39 million cartridge casings, 206,000 aircraft engines, 13,000 Navy fighter planes, 854,000 transport trucks, and nearly 2 million machine guns. With the fate of the free world at stake, Detroit and its surrounding industrial communities played heavily into America's quest to outbuild Hitler and Hirohito, allowing American industrial might to play a starring role in the Allies' eventual victories over Nazi and Japanese aggression. The Code Talkers of World War II. Pioneered by the Cherokee and Choctaw people during World War I, the Code Talkers of World War II were an elite group of Native Americans who played a key role in the Pacific, European, and North African theaters of war. Fighting with the United States Marine Corps, the estimated 500 Code Talkers' primary mission was to encrypt and decrypt vital battlefield communications using their native languages, which left their Nazi and Japanese adversaries unable to eavesdrop on Allied communications, troop movements, and offensive strategies. While the majority of World War II Code Talkers came from the Navajo Nation, they also included soldiers from the Lakota, Meskwaki, Mohawk, Comanche, Tlingit, Hopi, Cree, and Crow people. By way of example, a total of 14 Comanche Code Talkers took part in the D-Day invasion at Normandy, employing a vocabulary of over 100 code terms from their native language. A tank was defined as a turtle, while a bomber was a pregnant airplane. A machine gun was a sewing machine, while Adolf Hitler was a crazy white man. On June 6, 1944, 2 Comanche Code Talkers were embedded with each regiment that landed at Utah Beach, while their counterparts were assigned to the 4th Infantry Division headquarters, where they decrypted codes radioed from the beachhead. Many were wounded during the D-Day offensive known as Overlord, although thankfully none were killed. The Code Talkers Recognition Act of 2008 was signed into law by President George W. Bush on November 15th of that same year, honoring each surviving member with the Congressional Gold Medal. The Code Talkers' work was a key factor in the victories at Iwo Jima and Saipan, along with several other major battles in the Pacific theater. Credited with saving the lives of thousands of Allied personnel, the Code Talkers' encryption techniques comprise the only military code never to have been broken. The Codebreakers of World War II. Born in London in 1912, brilliant mathematician Alan Turing studied at both Cambridge and Princeton before joining the British government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, where top-secret work was carried out to decipher the military codes used by the Axis nations. The main focus of Turing's work at Bletchley was to crack the Enigma code, a type of enciphering machine used by the German armed forces to send secure messages between troop field commands as well as naval vessels at sea. Although Polish mathematicians had worked out how to read Enigma messages and had shared their knowledge with the British before the Nazis rolled into Poland, the Germans increased security measures at the outbreak of war by changing their cipher system daily. This made the task of breaking the code exponentially more difficult. Along with fellow codebreaker Gordon Welchman, Turing played a key role in breaking the Nazis' code by developing a machine called the bomb, which significantly reduced the work of breaking the ever-changing German code. Turing then went on to decipher the more complex Enigma code used by the German Navy, whose U-boats were inflicting heavy losses on Allied shipping. German naval Enigma messages were able to be read from 1941 onwards because of Turing's work, prompting Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower to comment after the war that breaking the Enigma code was a decisive part of the Allies' victory over the Germans. Before the war, Turing invented a hypothetical computing device that became known as the Universal Turing Machine, and after the war's conclusion, he continued to build on his earlier work, eventually publishing a design for what he called an automatic computing engine, a clear forerunner to the modern computer of today. In 1952, Turing was arrested for homosexuality and found guilty of gross indecency. The conviction was overturned when he agreed to undergo chemical castration. In 1954, he was found dead from cyanide poisoning, which was later ruled a suicide. The Night Witches of World War II. When Adolf Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets were desperate for any means of pushback against the advancing Nazi army. Known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, record-breaking female aviator Marina Raskova proposed an all-female bomber force, and when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin gave her the nod, Raskova quickly set about building out her team of daring flyers. Of 2,000 applicants, mainly women who had lost brothers or sweethearts to Nazi aggression, Raskova handpicked 400 for advanced flight training, which would be compressed into months rather than years. Flying under the cover of darkness, in bare-bones Polikarpov World War I-era biplanes, the women braved bullets and frostbite in the air, while receiving skepticism and sexual harassment back on the ground. Named Nachthexen, or night witches by the Nazis, due to the broom-like whooshing sound their planes made during bombing runs, the all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment became a crucial element of the Soviets' offensive strategy. Outfitted in oversized male uniforms and boots, the Night Witches flew in teams of two, a pilot up front, the navigator and bombardier in the rear, flying without parachutes or radios, the later making them nearly impossible to spot using ground-based radio locators. Their open cockpit biplanes gave the women no protection from the frigid conditions aloft, forcing the women to contend with wind and frostbite on a nightly basis. During the bitterly cold Soviet winters, the planes became so cold that just touching them without gloves could rip off bare skin, On the plus side, their planes were slower than the stall speeds of Nazi warplanes, making them extremely difficult to shoot down. While on the negative side, if one of the plywood and canvas planes did take on incendiary fire from the enemy, the old planes would burst into flames and fall from the sky. With a payload of only 2 bombs per plane, the regiment sent up 40 planes per mission, executing between 8 and 18 missions a night. The Night Witches traveled in formations, sending a single bait plane over the target in advance to attract German defensive spotlights, which further helped the bomber formation locate their targets. After the bait plane dropped a flare to illuminate the intended drop zone, the bombers would idle their engines to glide in over their targets, which was a stealth tactic that gave the Night Witches their signature witch's broom sound. All told, the Night Witches dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on Nazi frontline positions, making the Soviet Union the first country in the world to allow women in combat. By the end of the war, the Night Witches flew more than 30,000 missions, losing 30 pilots before their last flight on May 4, 1945, making the Night Witches a crucial asset in the Allies' victory over Nazi aggression. The Ritchie Boys of World War II. Trained for U.S. Army intelligence at the secret Camp Ritchie facility in Maryland, Ritchie Boys, as they were known, consisted of some 15,200 servicemen who had fled Germany and Austria when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power in pre-war Germany. 2,200 Ritchie Boys were Jewish refugees who fled anti-Semitic persecution in Germany, while all the Ritchie Boys were specifically selected for frontline intelligence gathering due to their fluency in German, French, Polish, and Italian, not to mention their innate understanding of German mentality and behavior. Trained in methods of intelligence, counterintelligence, prisoner interrogation, and psychological warfare, the Ritchie Boys' role in the war effort became an increasingly vital weapon to the Allies' eventual victory over Germany, working at strategic corps and army levels, analyzing German troop buildups and plans, while studying ways to demoralize the enemy. Many entered Europe with D-Day invasion forces at 5 Normandy beachheads, feeding the Allies with an enormous amount of valuable information against their common enemy, including advance warning of the German Bulge offensive in the Ardennes forest of France. The Ritchie Boys were also instrumental in softening German resistance by demoralizing them in both open and covert operations, while interrogating prisoners and defectors for information regarding German strength levels and troop movements, as well as assessing the physical and psychological state of the German army. Using targeted disinformation campaigns in German-language newspapers, flyers, and radio broadcasts, the Ritchie Boys further worked to quell German resistance to invading Allied forces, and while such tactics often proved hard to quantify, in a declassified post-war report by the U.S. Army, the Ritchie Boys were credited with contributing 60% of all credible intelligence gathered in the European theater of war, making the Ritchie Boys a vital asset in the Allies' eventual victory over Nazi aggression. Louis Zamperini survives the unimaginable. Born in 1917, Louis Zamperini was a tough kid out of Torrance, California. A smoker by age 5, Louis was always getting into fights, while his favorite trick was stealing beer from bootleggers. When the chief of police and his high school principal tried to redirect the misguided youth into track and field after a shaky start due to his long history of smoking, in 1934, Louis broke the world interscholastic mile record of 4 minutes 21 seconds, a record that would stand for the next 2 decades. Soon afterwards, the Torrance Tornado, as he was nicknamed, qualified for the 1936 Olympic Games, taking 8th place in the 5,000-meter race, but only after he ran the last quarter mile in just 56 seconds. The feat prompted a face-to-face meeting with Adolf Hitler, just 3 years before Nazi troops would blitzkrieg their way into Poland. After war broke out, Louis left USC and joined the Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater, earning the nickname Lucky Louie after cheating death multiple times as a bombardier until his luck ran out on May 27, 1943. On a search and rescue mission 800 miles from land, his B-24 went down at sea, killing 8 crew members but sparing Louis, the pilot Russell Phillips, and tail gunner Francis McNamara. The survivors floated in a life raft for 27 days, surviving on albatross meat and small fish, including the livers of small sharks they caught by hand. On the 27th day at sea, their luck turned south yet again, when they were spotted by Japanese fighters. The 3 men were strafed in a 30-minute assault, but thinking the castaways were dead, the Japanese finally left them alone. Miraculously, all 3 men had made it through the attack without a scratch. 6 days later, McNamara passed away on their 33rd day adrift, and as bad luck would have it, on their 47th day, having drifted some 2,000 miles to the Marshall Islands, they were made prisoners of war by the Japanese. Louis weighed just 65 pounds, and after being transferred to Execution Island, so named because most prisoners of war that were taken there were executed by decapitation with a samurai sword, Louis and other Allied prisoners were abused daily and kept on a starvation diet. On 3 occasions, Louis was subjected to medical experiments, but after 47 days on Execution Island, Louis was transferred to a prisoner of war camp, where he and others were horribly tortured by Mutsuhiro Watanabe, aka the Bird, an experience so horrifying that Louis still could not bring himself to talk about his experiences, even 50 years after the war. After the Japanese tried to use his Olympic fame in a propaganda radio broadcast, Louis refused and was reassigned to a labor camp. Out of spite, the Japanese transferred the Bird to Louis's camp, where the torture would begin anew. Freed at war's end, Louis married a Miami socialite and began drinking heavily as a way to chase the Bird and his memories of torture from his mind. With his marriage on the rocks, after his wife converted to Christ, Louis followed his wife's lead and converted as well.
I made my confession of faith in Christ. I knew I'd forgiven them. I knew it. I knew I was through getting drunk, I was through smoking, and I had a whole new life now.
FDR and Churchill. Following Hitler's 1939 invasion of Poland, in less than a year, the Nazi war machine had steamrolled across much of Europe, knocking on Great Britain's door by the time incoming Prime Minister Winston Churchill took office in May of 1940, just in time to face Britain's defeat at the Battle of Dunkirk. Fully aware that Britain's back was up against the wall, incoming third-term President Franklin D. Roosevelt anguished over his campaign promise to keep America out of the war, leading to one of his fireside chats, now known as his Arsenal of Democracy speech, leading to the signing of the Lend-Lease Act on March 11, 1941, which promised war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. As the world spiraled into chaos, destruction, and death, both leaders understood implicitly that their relationship and ability to work together held the utmost consequence for their nations and the world. To establish their relationship, the men held a clandestine meeting from August 9th through the 12th, 1941, aboard the USS Augusta off the coast of Newfoundland. To reach their meeting point, Churchill was obliged to cross the U-boat-infested Atlantic, while FDR concocted an elaborate story to throw off the press about a fishing trip off Cape Cod. Their meeting resulted in the 8-point Atlantic Charter, which laid American and British goals for the world after the conclusion of war. 4 months later, America entered World War II after Japan's unprovoked attack on American naval assets at Pearl Harbor, taking the lives of 2,403 American servicemen and civilians. Between September of 1939 until FDR's sudden death in April of 1945, the two world leaders exchanged nearly 2,000 letters and cables, while meeting in person a total of 11 times, spanning 113 days. Shunning the formalities of high office, the two men talked, dined, and drank together, including 4 stays at the White House, sometimes for weeks on end, prompting Eleanor Roosevelt to write that I was solicitous for his comfort, but I was always glad when he departed, for I knew that my husband would need a rest, since he had carried on his usual hours of work in addition to the unusual ones Mr. Churchill preferred. Besides their conference meetings with Joseph Stalin and other Allied leaders, which helped galvanize the Cold War years to come, on September 14, 1944, the two men met in FDR's Hyde Park study, initiating the Manhattan Project, which ultimately ended the Second World War, making the relationship between Churchill and FDR a friendship which saved the world from Nazi aggression. Hitler's cavalry of the future. Just 12 days after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, one of his first major speeches came in a 1933 German auto show, where he professed his intention to raise up the German auto industry through tax cuts and deregulation, with the tacit objective of growing Germany's auto industry in tandem with the nation's secret developments in aviation warfare, both actions specifically banned under the Treaty of Versailles following Germany's defeat in the First World War. Appointing his longtime friend and failed beer hall pooch co-conspirator Adolf Hühnlein to head the newly formed National Socialist Motor Corps, or NSKK, both men understood the Corps' true and quite secret intention, which was to reinvigorate Germany's preparedness and ability to wage war. Working with both Daimler-Benz and rival Auto Union AG, the later a consortium of car makers including Porsche, Audi, DKW, and Wanderer, German automakers soon dominated the racing scene during the Grand Prix Formula Series of 1934, producing the fastest, most advanced race cars ever to compete in motorsport racing of its time. Producing race cars nicknamed Silver Arrows, the two companies dominated both French and Italian automakers on tracks throughout Europe, each race featuring Korpsführer Hühnlein at the starting line, dressed sharply in his metal-laden Nazi uniform. Behind the scenes, however, the NSKK had quietly trained a volunteer force of some 187,000 skilled drivers, while German automakers stood ready to crank out airplane engines, tanks, heavy trucks, armored vehicles, and the spare parts necessary for the successful engagement of a mechanized war. By the time Hitler's intentions became clear to the outside world, following his 1939 blitzkrieg invasion of Poland, as more countries fell to the Third Reich, Daimler-Benz executives forced occupied populations, concentration camp inmates, and prisoners of war to work in their factories under draconian conditions, while the NSKK's pool of drivers provided ready manpower for Wehrmacht motorized infantry divisions. The NSKK also weighed heavily in Germany's fortification of Siegfried Line defenses, while its motorcycle troops became the self-declared spearhead of the modern war. The NSKK also played a key role in the persecution and deportation of Jews, making Hitler's cavalry of the future an international missed warning sign of the horrors to come. The Black Panthers of World War II. Coming ashore at Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944, minus future Baseball Hall of Famer Jackie Robinson, who was separated from the unit for refusing to move to the back of a segregated military bus. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, lived up to their motto of "Come Out Fighting" on November 7th of that same year, attacking and capturing the German-held town of Morville-le-Vicq in support of the 26th Infantry Division. In an age of segregation in the U.S. military, the Black Panthers more than proved their mettle during their 183 days of continuous operational deployment. In November alone, the Black Panthers lost 24 men in combat, along with 81 wounded and 44 non-combat related fatalities. With the German army on its heels by mid-December 1944, after bouncing from one infantry division to the next, the Black Panthers were informed about the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last-ditch effort to hold the Western Front by splitting Allied forces and capturing the Allies' vital resupply port at Antwerp. Ordered to proceed immediately to the southern tip of the Bulge at the town of Bastogne, a place in the Ardennes forest where all roads converged. In conditions of night, fog, and snow, the Black Panthers fought their way to the Germans' vital resupply point at Tillet, engaging in a brutal attack on the German army's flank, ultimately proving victorious in one of the most pivotal battles during Germany's last significant offensive. On March 21, 1945, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower commissioned Task Force Rhine, which included the Black Panthers and the 409th Infantry, with orders to break through the Siegfried Line and advance to the Rhine River in Germany. Considered the beginning of the end for Hitler's years of military aggression in Europe, the 400-mile Siegfried Line was built to defend the Rhineland, with 18,000 interlocking bunkers and pillboxes connected by tunnels and roads, minefields, and pyramidal cement barriers known as Dragon's Teeth, all of which made for gritty fighting for the 761st and the 409th. Achieving their goal on March 23rd, the Black Panthers continued the fight into Central Europe, all the way to VE Day on May 8, 1945. During the war, the Black Panthers received a Presidential Unit Citation for its important contribution in the Allies' victory over Nazi aggression, along with 1 Medal of Honor, 11 Silver Stars, and some 300 Purple Hearts, making the Black Panthers of the 761st one of the toughest fighting units of the Second World War. The Battle of Gazala. By the spring of 1942, the Germans and their Italian allies had been locked in a back-and-forth battle against the British for control of North Africa, ever since Italian dictator Benito Mussolini attacked British-held bases in Egypt 2 years prior. Mussolini's offensive ended in a rout for the Italians, who clearly bit off more than they could chew, prompting Adolf Hitler to dispatch Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps to fortify the Italians in February of 1941. Rommel's challenge was formidable from the onset of his arrival, since the British Eighth Army was dug in along a 40-mile defensive front known as the Gazala Line, so named for a town along the Mediterranean coast, where the British had set up strong points known as boxes, from Gazala in the north to Bir Hakeim to the south. Known as the Desert Fox for his bold strategies and blitzkrieg-style offensives, on May 26, 1942, Rommel devised a feint maneuver against the British along the Gazala Line, sending German General Kruel and his Allied troops against British forces on the left, while the main 3-component strike force of the Panzer Army Africa attacked from the right, with Rommel commanding from the front. Led by Commanding General Claude Auchinleck and his second-in-command General Neil Ritchie, at 9 p.m. on a moonlit, cool desert evening, Rommel's 10,000-vehicle army attacked the Gazala Line with fearsome intensity, and while the first 3 hours proved successful for Rommel, his troops were soon overwhelmed by Britain's latest surprise weapon, the American-built Grant M3 tank, a buildup of lethal firepower that went undetected by German intelligence. As a result, the Panzer Army Africa took a beating at Britain's Knightsbridge box, forcing the 15th Panzer Division to run out of gas due to failing German supply lines. Regrouping yet again, Rommel's forces encircled a significant portion of the British 8th Army in a move now referred to as the Cauldron or the Gazala Gallop. And while Auchinleck's forces were able to break the German encirclement at heavy cost to both sides, the battle ended inconclusively, exposing Auchinleck to criticism when he failed to pursue Rommel's badly weakened Afrika Korps. The battle forced the British to abandon Gazala in a fallback move to El Alamein, while the battle also forced both sides to re-examine their supply lines and overall logistical strategies, making the Battle of Gazala a study in Allied resistance in the face of brutal adversity. The Battle of Midway. Six months after the heavy loss of American servicemen and naval assets inflicted by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto became convinced that the Imperial Japanese Navy now enjoyed a numerical advantage over the Americans. Hoping to replicate the success of the Pearl Harbor attacks, Yamamoto sought to annihilate the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet through means of a surprise attack on American naval assets at Midway Island. After a diversionary attack by a smaller Japanese force on the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, Yamamoto engaged in a three-pronged attack on Midway. First came air attacks on the island from fighter planes launched by the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soru, followed by a naval and infantry invasion of the island. The third phase, after expected reinforcements from Pearl Harbor had been brought in by the Americans, Yamamoto would then lead his own fleet to Midway after waiting patiently 600 miles to the west. Thanks to U.S. Navy codebreakers, Japan's planned attack was known by the Americans several weeks in advance of Japan's offensive. After a failed counterattack by American B-17 bombers on June 3, 1942, the Japanese air attack of June 4th inflicted severe damage to the U.S. base on Midway, which prompted retaliatory airstrikes by U.S. Devastator torpedo bombers against the 4 Japanese carriers. While Japanese Zero fighters shot down the first wave of American fighters, the second wave hit pay dirt against the Akagi, Kaga, and Soru. After the losses, Japan's surviving carrier Hiru launched 2 attacks on the USS Yorktown aircraft carrier, which had to be abandoned yet remained afloat. After the loss of the Yorktown, U.S. dive bombers took out the Hiru, putting an end to any hopes for a victory in favor of Japan. In the end, the U.S. victory in the Battle of Midway ended Japan's expansionary aspirations in the Pacific, forcing them into a defensive posture until their surrender on September 2, 1945. The Battle of Stalingrad. Considered the industrial heartland of Russia, Adolf Hitler ordered his Wehrmacht to attack and occupy Stalingrad, not just to slow the production of Russian war material, but also for propaganda purposes, since the city was named after Russian dictator Joseph Stalin. After Hitler proclaimed that all the city's male residents would be killed and the women deported, Stalin ordered all Russians in and around Stalingrad to take up arms in defense of the city. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army began their assault on August 23, 1942, but were successfully repelled in skirmishes near the city at a cost to the Russians of nearly 200,000 casualties. Over the next several days, the German Luftwaffe rendered the Volga River impassable for maritime traffic, and by September, the Luftwaffe gained air supremacy over Stalingrad, bombing the city into ruins by the fall of 1942. With less than 20,000 Russian troops in the city and more than 300,000 Nazi and Axis forces closing in, Russian generals called for a massive influx of reinforcements, which effectively encircled Germany's positions in an offensive known as Operation Uranus. Understanding that the Germans were unaccustomed to Russia's harsh winter conditions, along with a daunting 1,200-mile resupply line, the flanking Russians deprived German forces of war material and food. During Operation Little Saturn, the Russians decimated lines of mostly Italian fighters to the west of Stalingrad, yet Hitler refused to surrender even as his troops ran desperately low on food and ammunition. By February of 1943, Russian troops regained control over Stalingrad, taking more than 100,000 German POWs, who for the most part would later die from disease and starvation. Germany's egregious losses at Stalingrad marked the first time that Hitler publicly acknowledged a German defeat in their attempts to dominate Europe, putting Nazi and Axis powers on the defensive for the first time in the war. Many historians believe that the Battle of Stalingrad marked a crucial turning point in the momentum of World War II, paving the way for an eventual victory by the Allies in May of 1945. The Battle of Guadalcanal. When Japanese troops swept onto Guadalcanal in June of 1942, followed by American Marines 2 months later, intent on removing the enemy from the island, few people outside of Polynesia had ever heard of this 2,000 square mile speck of jungle in the Solomon Islands. Over the next 6 months, Guadalcanal and its neighboring islands would prove to be a critical turning point between the Allies and their Japanese adversaries during World War II. Surprised by the Allies' offensive, the Japanese made determined attempts between August and November to retake the airfield they had begun to build on Guadalcanal. The campaign would involve 3 major land battles fought in dense jungle conditions, 7 pivotal naval battles, 5 nighttime surface actions and 2 carrier battles, and almost daily aerial dogfights that lasted until early November, when the Japanese made their last-ditch attempt to land enough troops on Guadalcanal to retake their geographically strategic yet uncompleted airbase. In December, the Japanese surrendered their efforts to retake the island, evacuating the last of their remaining forces on February 7, 1943. The Battle of Guadalcanal followed the successful Allied defensive actions at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in May and June of 1942. Along with the battles of Milne Bay and Bunagona, the Guadalcanal campaign marked the Allies' transition from defensive operations to offensive superiority, effectively seizing the strategic initiative in the Pacific theater of operations. While the Japanese were clearly in a defensive rather than an expansionary mode after their losses at Guadalcanal, they continued to fight with extreme ferocity during the Solomon Islands campaign, the New Guinea campaign, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, the Maria and Palau Islands campaign, as well as the attacks on the Japanese islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese would finally surrender on September 2, 1945, after the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, followed 3 days later with a second nuclear detonation at Nagasaki. The Imperial Japanese Navy bombs America. On September 9, 1942, submarine I-25 of the Imperial Japanese Navy surfaced 33 miles off the coast of Oregon, directly abeam of the Cape Blanco lighthouse. As his seaplane was being unpacked and assembled from its hold in front of the conning tower, pilot Nobuo Fuchida placed a strand of his hair into a small wooden box. "If I were to die and my body could not be recovered," he recalled after the war, These remains would be sent back to my wife. When his plane was assembled and on its catapult, Fujita tucked his 400-year-old family samurai sword against the inner sidewall of his cockpit, a tradition he began in flight school. While Fujita would rather have dropped his ordnance on nearby Fort Stevens, his orders were to drop his incendiary bombs into dense Oregon forest, causing an anticipated runaway fire near the small lumbering town of Brookings. With 520 thermite pellets housed in each of his two bombs, Japanese war planners hoped that the resultant 2,700-degree heat from the twin detonations would match the September 1936 fire that destroyed 287,000 acres of Oregon forest while burning the coastal town of Bandon to the ground. The tactic was also intended to scare the Americans, forcing the U.S. Navy to divert war assets away from the Solomon Islands in defense of the western United States. After catapulting from the submarine's midget flight deck and flying a good ways inland near Mount Emily, Fujita ordered his weapons officer, Soichi Okuda, to drop the first bomb, followed by a second release a mile or so away. The detonations caused multiple clusters of fires, but thanks to the watchful eye of forest fire spotters and a godsend blanket of rain, the fires were quickly extinguished by the combined hand of man and Mother Nature. 20 years after the war, a group of JCs from the Junior Chamber of Commerce in Brookings, Oregon, invited Fujita and his wife to visit, where Fujita made history as the first and last Japanese fighter to reach American soil. And on May 24, 1962, after Oregon Governor Mark Hatfield and President John F. Kennedy approved the goodwill visit, Fujita and his wife Ayako closed another chapter from one of the bloodiest periods in world history. Today on the Daily Dose. Operation Torch. Given the top-secret nature of Operation Torch, few Americans took notice of the massive buildup of warships, troops, and other weapons of war amassing on the east coast of the United States throughout the bulk of 1942. Rails and highways bristled with eastbound processions of military might, a massive parade of equipment, supplies, and personnel. Across the pond, British tanks, guns, and troops clogged rail lines in a similar fashion as the two Allied nations prepared for the invasion of French North Africa, intended to draw Axis forces away from the Eastern Front in hopes of relieving mounting stress on a hard-pressed Soviet army. While American war planners had pushed for a landing in Northern Europe, Operation Torch came about as a compromise with British war leaders who felt that a premature D-Day-style invasion of the European mainland would lead to disaster at such an early stage in the war. From November 8th through the 16th, U.S. and British forces engaged General Dwight D. Eisenhower's three-pronged offensive on French North Africa, the western flank at Casablanca, a center prong at Oman, and an eastern offensive at Algiers, with plans for a rapid advance on the German-Italian Africa Corps at Tunis, in conjunction with the second Allied pincer-style advance on Tunis from Egypt. After loosening up shoreline defenses, with varying degrees of Allied naval bombardment, the Western Task Force at Casablanca experienced both heavy resistance and bad weather, eventually capturing French Vichy's primary Atlantic naval base after a short siege, while the Center Task Force suffered damage to some of their ships as they landed in shallow waters, at the same time sinking or driving off all French naval assets. The Eastern Task Force met with even less resistance following an anti-Vichy coup attempt on the day of invasion, leading to the surrender of Algiers on the opening day of the campaign. After 3 years of Axis aggression, which dictated the tempo of Allied defensive responses, the rapid success of Operation Torch marked a turning point moment in the Allies' attempts to push back against Axis aggression, forcing Axis troops to defend both its eastern and western fronts. the invasion force of some 100,000 U.S. and British personnel demonstrated a successful, albeit imperfect, collaboration between British and American war planners, which, if viewed in tandem with the Americans' promising Solomon Islands campaign and the Soviets' ability to hold the Eastern Front, the triumvirate of events positioned the Allies in a significantly better place in late 1942 than they had been in early spring, making Operation Torch a critical breakthrough in the Allies' steady march toward victory. Today on the Daily Dose, the French sink their own navy. Following the Allies' successful invasion of French North Africa, Nazi leaders reneged on their armistice of 1940 with Vichy France, setting in motion operations Anton and Lille with the intent of capturing French warships and submarines for use against Allied naval assets. Long before the Germans set their sights on the French fleet, British and American leaders feared such a takeover by the Nazis, obliging the British to attack the French Navy at Mer el-Kabir on July 3, 1940, followed by the Battle of Dakar on September 23 of that same year. On November 11, 1942, German and Italian troops closed in on the French coastal city of Toulon, home to the French fleet, which triggered Vichy Secretary of the Navy Admiral Gabriel Auffin to order Admirals Jean de Laborde and André Marquis to oppose the invading armies without bloodshed by means of local negotiation. If that failed, his orders went on, then the admirals were obliged to scuttle their ships in port or at sea. Long before the impending attack by the Germans and the Italians, the French Navy had strengthened Toulon's defenses against an anticipated attack by Allied forces, which included a premeditated game plan for scuttling the fleet if an Allied attack was deemed imminent. On November 27, 1942, 4 German combat groups and a motorcycle battalion entered the greater Toulon area at 4 a.m., catching Vichy officers completely by surprise, but not before one of the officers transmitted the order to Admiral Laborde to scuttle the fleet as quickly as possible. Scuttle, 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 the order went out from Laborde's station on the battleship Strasbourg, prompting scuttling crews to set demolition charges and open sea valves on as many ships as possible. The Germans' main force got lost on the foreign roads surrounding Toulon, giving the French a full hour's head start, and when the Germans finally reached the gates of the naval base, French sentries further delayed their entry with the fabricated need for additional paperwork. In the end, of the 164 vessels in the French fleet, 77 were successfully scuttled, while 3 destroyers, 4 submarines, and 39 small ships were captured by the Germans, costing the lives of 12 French combatants and wounding 26 others. The Germans, in turn, would suffer only 1 wounded soldier during the assault on Toulon Harbor. And there you have it. The French sink their own navy. Today on the Daily Dose.